we're joined by much-known author Christopher Moore to discuss his latest book, Fear and Loathing in Bangkok. Thanks for joining us today, Chris.
Pleasure, Anna.
So your latest book, Fear and Loathing in Bangkok, it's a series of essays. Can you tell us a little bit more about the genre of essays that you've included?
I've tried to include essays that cover a variety of areas I think of interest to people who live here, expats and people who are interested in Thailand. Basically, criminal justice system, ideas of law enforcement, the courts, the lawyers, that's all important, as well as political change and the great unknown, the technological change, which is disrupting economies everywhere. And that provides a lot of opportunity to kind of look under the surface.
I think one of my favourite chapters was one of the beginning of the book about dumbest criminals, and in particular the guy who produced a packet of cocaine to the judge to prove he wasn't carrying a gun. What's the funniest or most outlandish thing that you've heard happen in a court of law?
In a court of law, I think you tend not to hear the most outlandish things. You tend to look at the results, and sometimes the results can be quite surprising. I think last year, for example, there were 5 police officers who were arrested, charged, and convicted of murder, and 3 of them were sentenced to death, and they were released on bail. Now, I think that was quite an unusual thing from a Canadian lawyer's point of view, that someone who's been sentenced to death is released on bail. We'll give you a phone call when we've scheduled your lethal injection kind of thing.
Doesn't really give you much incentive to turn up, does it?
If part of the bail proceeding is what are the chances of someone running, I would think if you have a death sentence, you probably don't have a lot to lose by running.
I would agree, I think. I also really enjoyed the story about Mr. Montree and his so-called Noah's Ark.
Yes.
How do you hear about these stories? How do you go about doing your research?
I think that's part of the real fun, and it's the challenge of writing about Thailand, is to talk to people. I mean, what you find out when you write is that there are a lot of people with very great stories out there, and very few people who want to listen to them. And so what I try to do is to find people who have an interesting story about their experience with Thai culture, living here, brushes with law, work, study, and it gives a kind of a composite idea of what life is for people who come to this country for a fresh start.
Do you ever hear anything that's just too risque to include or to write about?
Well, it's interesting because, risque always involves a kind of impropriety or indecency of some sort. So, you hear stories that will be a little on the blue side or suggesting activities of the bedroom. I try to write about all rooms in the house, the kitchen, the living room, and the bedroom. So people occupy not one room in a house. I don't write horror, so I don't write about attics and basements by and large, but I do take a look at other rooms and ask what's going on and why it's going on and how it connects up with people's lives.
And in one of your chapters, and possibly quite appropriately given what's happened recently in Bangkok, you talk about Kreng Jai and you explain a little bit about the background to the current political situation. Can you just explain that a little bit more for us now?
Sure. Kreng Jai is one of the cornerstone Jai words. I did a book some years ago called Heart Talk, which brought together all of the various Jai words. At least I think the vast majority of Jai words, because I don't think anyone could ever get all of them, but I got close to 1,000 phrases. And Kreng Jai is one of the central ones. And it really means a little bit of awe, fear, showing of deference, respect. That's the kind of the traditional definition. But you have to kind of look behind things a bit to look at what is the model of that. And the model is really the family, and where the father and the mother would be in control, and basically it's an unequal relationship. You're asking someone in a very polite way for their kindness in helping you to solve some problem. It could be a problem of a place to live or a job or some encounter with the police, any variety of those kinds of issues. And so someone who has a position of status, authority, of rank would then, as a favor, bestow, as an act of kindness, some kind of help to reaching a solution for this person. So that's not really an equal relationship, it is an unequal relationship. And part of the bargain is loyalty, and unquestioned loyalty. So in a Grenjai system, you tend not to criticize or challenge or otherwise question the person in authority as to, well, hold on a minute, I don't think that's sort of the best approach. What about this? Or hold on a minute, you know, you said this, but last week you said that. So those kinds of things are discouraged in Grenjai, but they're part of the overall system of most democratic regimes, where questioning and challenging and conflict are an absolutely essential part of the enterprise of the political system. So there is a huge transition going on with voters finding that really that they've been empowered. They don't need Grenjai. Collectively, they can act to influence the government in a way that individually they could not. You might be able to influence your father to help you, but to influence the whole village, or the whole ampere, or the whole province, or the whole country, that's an order of scale, quite a different magnitude. And Grenjai doesn't work as well at that scaled up system.
So just taking that a little bit further and looking at the present situation in Bangkok
Sure.
now, in your view, how important is the right to vote for one individually?
Well, I think if you have a democratic system, elections and voting are a very essential part of how that system functions, because democracy really goes back to demos, the Greek word for the common people. And the common people, by exercising their vote, confer legitimacy on the people who exercise power and authority over them. So we've grown up in a Greek 2,000-year tradition where legitimacy comes from the ballot box. Now, it's not that there aren't problems with that in Canada or Australia or England or the US. One can see that it's an imperfect system. But in terms of holding political authority accountable, it's a system that ultimately over time does work, and it works better than the alternative.
And so where exactly do you see this current Bangkok shutdown going?
Well,
if anywhere.
Well, I think that's something you want to ask an astrologer or someone with a crystal ball. And I'm a novelist. I don't have a crystal ball, so I can't really see that far into the future. It could go any number of ways. I mean, I just came from the Asok and Sukhumvit intersection. There are really no demonstrators or protesters there. They're the kind of the regular force that guards that intersection. And you can kind of see that the tides adapt very quickly. It's part of the culture. This is becoming part of the new normality. People are now just, oh, well, yeah, of course there are people there in the intersection. Of course we can't drive there. And there's a kind of resignation and acceptance at some level. But that's because the full impact of that hasn't hit yet. I mean, it does have an economic impact. It has an impact in terms of tourism and lots of other things. But those happen gradually over time. They're not the kind of dramatic thing of a stage presentation. And so that's where planning comes in, and you have to think. Now it looks kind of like one big party. Most of the evenings people are out there, and people think, yes, there are legitimate concerns and concerns for change, and at least these people are out trying to do something about change. But whether they're doing it in the best possible way and using the best possible alternatives in a democratic system is open to question.
Sure. And just expanding on one of the points that you just made, in one of your other essays, Data Mining in the Age of Terrorism, you talk about the Bangkok bombings back in 2012 and the impact that they had on tourism. Do you think Bangkok's being affected at the moment by lack of tourists due to what's happening?
I have really only anecdotal evidence, but from talking with business people, there is a sense that the number of people coming into Bangkok is reduced. There have been cancellations of bookings in hotels, flight cancellations. The number of flights between here and Hong Kong and Singapore, I think, have been reduced. So you can start to see that tourists, like a lot of people, are fearful. And they have many choices. There's no reason why they really have to come to Thailand as opposed to someplace else. So people do kind of a risk calculation. And so they'll look at dramatic news clips on YouTube or on the local TV station, or read in the newspaper, oh, you know, there are all these demonstrators, people got shot here or someone got injured. I don't want to take the risk, is the kind of thing that one worries about, because people try to avoid that. They're going on holiday. They want an adventure, which is finding a neat new seashell on the shore. They don't want the adventure of finding a discarded casing from a AK-47 round.
Absolutely. We've noticed as well, just moving on from that and just talking about your work more generally, that Thailand, possibly more than most other countries, seems to have a lot of books written about it, and there's you and obviously many others base a lot of your work in Bangkok and Thailand. What do you think people find so interesting to read about the country here?
I think people are interested in a quite different culture, which comes from a different history, a different language tradition, a different religion, different political setup. People look at that and then they have a better idea of their own system, because they see the differences that someone else has built in that they take for granted. And so some ways when you look closely at another culture, you're observing just not that culture, you're observing the things that are different from your home culture. And that creates a kind of growth. You start to see a lot of the things that you take for granted are really a matter of choice.
And I mean, we've read as well one of your other books, The Orwell Brigade.
Yeah.
It's our view at the moment that there seems to be more expats living in Bangkok than ever before. What do you think the reason behind this is? Do you think it's due to the political situations in the Western countries? So, for example, Obama's been hitting the news quite a lot recently about so-called Obamacare, and people aren't really happy with that.
Yeah. I think worldwide there is a fair amount of discontent amongst the middle class, because we've kind of grown up with the idea that the middle class is a good thing, that the middle class is kind of the bedrock of democracy, of economic systems, and the media plays to the middle class. What's happening in the middle class is getting gutted in a lot of places. So it's a little bit like in the publishing industry. There used to be a lot of mid-list authors. The mid-list authors have basically vanished. Either you're a blockbuster or you're with the unwashed. So there's no middle class left for writers, there's no middle class left for a lot of people, and that's gradually changing. But places like Thailand, there still is a middle class. That makes it unusual. So people with middle class aspirations are looking around and saying they have no real prospects or opportunities at home, and they see a place like Thailand, which has 2% unemployment, which is nothing. And it has been growing, and they see opportunity. So they're going for different reasons. When I came here 25 years ago, it was a very different expat population. You know, it was the adventurer, the journalist, the ex-Vietnam veteran, the diplomat. It was a much smaller, contained expat community, which probably had much more in common with Somerset Maugham and Joseph Conrad than the one that is here today. So there is, in a way, a kind of break of continuity. And that's what I try to capture in the books. Because the expats who come here have not remained the same over time. It's a dynamic, ever-changing, diverse group of people.
That's great. That's really interesting. Thank you so much for joining us today, Chris.
It's been my pleasure, Anna. Thank you.